That man is not allowed in my pub. Get out of my pub. Go on. Get out of my pub.
The evening of Saturday, December 21, 2024, will be remembered as a watershed moment in British history, not for a single catastrophic event, but for the collective realization that the nation's streets had fundamentally transformed into something unrecognizable. As darkness descended over the United Kingdom, reports began flooding emergency services. 10 individuals had been allegedly stabbed by a lone knifeman in yet another brutal attack that shocked even a population increasingly desensitized to violence. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was merely the latest chapter in a terrifying narrative that has been unfolding across British cities for years, a story of escalating violence, institutional failure, and a government seemingly paralyzed by its own ideological constraints. The statistics paint a portrait of a nation in crisis. 53,000 confirmed knife attacks in a single year. That's not just a number on a spreadsheet, it represents a new knife crime occurring every 10 minutes, around the clock, day after day. It means that while families sit down for dinner, while children sleep, while commuters travel to work, somewhere in Britain, a blade is being drawn with deadly intent. The erosion of public trust has been equally dramatic. A 28% collapse in confidence in law enforcement represents more than statistical decline, it signals a fundamental breakdown in the social contract between the British people and their institutions. When citizens no longer believe the authorities can protect them, the foundations of civil society begin to crumble. And crumble they have, as British streets have been transformed into what many are now calling war zones, with territorial disputes settled not through legal channels but through cold steel and intimidation. The Dangzhou magic incident, a flashpoint for national outrage, the attack on a young woman, officials insisting on calling her a young woman rather than a girl in what many perceived as semantic hair-splitting designed to minimize the horror, became a flashpoint for accumulated frustrations. The assailant, identified as Dangzhou magic, became a symbol of everything the British public believes has gone catastrophically wrong with their nation's approach to immigration, integration, and public safety. The crowds that gathered in response didn't care about the official designations or the careful language deployed by government spokespersons. They saw what they saw, another violent attack, another life shattered, another family destroyed by violence that they believe should never have been allowed to take root in their communities. The anger wasn't simply about this single incident, it was about the accumulation of thousands of incidents, each one chipping away at the sense of security that British citizens once took for granted. By 8:05 p.m., protesters had mobilized across multiple cities, from the heart of London to the industrial centers of Leeds. Their demands were uncompromising and deliberately provocative: the immediate deportation of 600,000 individuals back to Africa and the Middle East. It was a demand that cut straight to the heart of Britain's immigration debate, bypassing all the careful euphemisms and diplomatic language that typically characterize political discourse on this incendiary topic. Prime Minister Keir Starmer's response was immediate and unequivocal. He dismissed the demand as absolutely intolerant and impossible, framing it as the ravings of extremists rather than the desperate cry of citizens who feel their country slipping away from them. But Starmer's words, intended to calm tensions and reaffirm the government's commitment to humanitarian principles, instead poured fuel on an already raging fire. The night the streets erupted at 8:23 p.m., the situation deteriorated from heated protest to violent confrontation. A massive assault was launched against police cordons established to maintain separation between protesters and counter-demonstrators. The order from police command was clear and uncompromising: hold the line at all costs. But theory collided brutally with reality as officers found themselves facing not just verbal hostility but coordinated physical attacks. By 8:40 p.m., the Sharp platoon, elite police units trained for exactly these scenarios, was forced into a tactical retreat after taking volleys of fireworks directly to their faces. These weren't the celebratory rockets launched at New Year's Eve parties. These were weapons, deliberately aimed at law enforcement with the clear intent to injure and intimidate. The symbolism was profound. Britain's specialized police units, representing the state's monopoly on legitimate force, were retreating from civilian crowds. This wasn't holiday celebration. This was total chaos, the kind of urban breakdown that governments typically associate with failed states, not with one of the world's oldest democracies. The images broadcast across news networks and shared viral across social media showed a nation teetering on the edge, with the thin blue line that separates order from anarchy bending to the breaking point. Starmer's statistical defense and its spectacular backfire in the face of mounting criticism and visible evidence of societal breakdown. Prime Minister Starmer issued a statement attempting to counter the narrative of surging crime with hard data. He pointed to statistics showing murder rates are down 6% and knife murders down 1%, presenting these figures as evidence that his government's policies were working despite public perception to the contrary. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In attempting to fight emotion with statistics, Starmer demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the national mood. The British public wasn't demanding academic debates about crime trends, they were demanding action in response to what they could see with their own eyes and experience in their own communities. The Prime Minister's reliance on percentage points felt tone-deaf, disconnected from the reality of ordinary citizens who no longer felt safe walking their own streets. Opposition leader Nigel Farage, sensing an opportunity to deliver a devastating counter-punch, fired back with explosive allegations. He claimed that over 70% of crime remains in the shadows unreported, unrecorded, and therefore absent from the official statistics Starmer was touting. More provocatively, Farage pointed directly at what he characterized as the involvement of illegal arrivals in criminal activity, arguing that official crime data is fundamentally compromised. Farage's logic was straightforward and, to his supporters, compelling. Those arriving on small boats across the English Channel aren't in police databases. They hold no documents that would allow authorities to track their movements or criminal histories. They exist, in effect, as ghosts within the system, present and active but invisible to the statistical apparatus the government relies upon to understand and respond to crime trends. This argument struck at the heart of one of Britain's most contentious political debates. If the official crime statistics don't capture the full scope of criminal activity because a significant population exists outside the formal identification systems, then what basis does the government have for its policy decisions? It's a question that Starmer's administration has consistently struggled to answer convincingly. The rapid escalation, from protest to urban warfare in just 2 hours, the situation evolved from tense standoffs to something approximating urban warfare. 6 new police vans were deployed to reinforce stretched units attempting to maintain control. 3 of those vans were quickly surrounded by crowds and destroyed, their burning hulks serving as improvised barricades and powerful symbols of the state's impotence. By 9:05 p.m., groups of masked men had initiated direct clashes with police units. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed. The protesters, if that term even remained appropriate, were no longer simply demanding action from their government. They were taking the streets into their own hands, asserting physical control over territory they believed their government had surrendered to criminal elements. Glass bottles became projectiles, launched at mounted police units in scenes more reminiscent of riots in developing nations than in the United Kingdom. The carefully trained horses, usually an imposing symbol of British law enforcement's capacity to manage crowds, became targets rather than deterrents. By the end of the night, 78 people had been hospitalized on both sides of the confrontation, police officers and civilians alike bearing the physical scars of a nation tearing itself apart. The media narrative versus the street reality. Multiple media outlets quickly moved to frame the night's events through a familiar lens, labeling the participants as far-right extremists engaged in politically motivated violence. This framing, while convenient for maintaining certain narratives about who constitutes a threat to British society, sat uneasily with the diverse composition of the crowds and the breadth of their grievances. Prime Minister Starmer, speaking to European leaders in the aftermath, insisted that Britain is fully under control and that the radicals have almost zero support. It was a claim that seemed to exist in a parallel universe from the one visible on British streets. At the London protest alone, placards were raised bearing statistics that told a very different story from the Prime Minister's reassurances. The numbers displayed on those homemade signs were stark and damning, a 320% rise in machete attacks since the year 2000. Critics warned that 80% of women and children now live under the shadow of potential violence, a statistic that, if even remotely accurate, represents a catastrophic failure of the state's most fundamental obligation to protect its citizens. Hotels ablaze, the unknown origin of new violence. As the night progressed, a new dimension of chaos emerged. 7 hotels were suddenly ablaze, their flames visible across city skylines. The causes remained officially unknown, with investigators struggling to determine whether the fires resulted from coordinated arson, accidental spread from street violence, or some other factor entirely. What wasn't unknown was the significance of the targets. Many of these hotels had been converted into migration centers, housing asylum seekers and recent arrivals while their claims were processed through Britain's overwhelmed immigration system. Whether the fires were deliberately set or not, their symbolic importance was impossible to miss. These buildings had become physical representations of the immigration policies that millions of Britons believed were destroying their communities. Police rapidly deployed additional barricades to shield remaining migration centers from potential attack. The message was clear. Authorities anticipated that these facilities would become targets for additional violence. By fortifying them, the government was simultaneously protecting vulnerable populations and acknowledging that segments of the British public viewed these centers not as humanitarian necessities but as enemy installations on their own soil. By this point in the evening, 69 arrests had been made, a substantial number that nonetheless represented a tiny fraction of those participating in the disturbances. But the real story wasn't in the arrest statistics. The worst revelations lay elsewhere, in the underlying data that explained why so many Britons had reached their breaking point. The teenage knife epidemic, a generation at risk. Perhaps no single statistic captures the depth of Britain's crisis more powerfully than this: a 240% surge in teenage knife homicides compared to 2015. This isn't about abstract crime rates or policy debates, it's about children killing children with weapons that were once exotic but have now become commonplace in British youth culture. The violence has penetrated every sanctuary. There have been 150 documented attacks inside schools. Institutions that were once considered safe havens now require metal detectors and armed security. Kitchen cleavers and machetes are being seized from classrooms with such regularity that it barely makes local news anymore. Weapons that in previous generations might have been found in a butcher shop or a museum are now standard equipment in teenage territorial disputes. The government's response to this epidemic of youth violence has been, to its critics, emblematic of its broader failures. Rather than addressing root causes or implementing harsh deterrent measures, Starmer's administration has introduced kindness lessons designed to influence student minds through education about empathy and conflict resolution. To those watching their communities descend into violence, this response feels not just inadequate but insulting, a response so utterly disconnected from the severity of the problem that it calls into question whether the government understands what's happening at all. You can't teach kindness to a teenager already carrying a machete with the intent to use it. You can't workshop your way out of gang warfare that has claimed hundreds of young lives. The Channel crossings continue unabated even as British cities burned. The pattern that has defined Britain's immigration crisis continued without interruption. 3 boats were spotted arriving from across the English Channel, their passengers adding to the numbers that have become the focal point of Britain's political breakdown. It was in this context that Nigel Farage made his most dramatic intervention of the night, declaring that Britain has one chance left and laying out a comprehensive alternative vision for how the nation should respond to its security crisis. Farage's controversial roadmap, American Solutions for British Problems. Farage's proposals were deliberately provocative, drawing explicitly from American models that many British officials have long resisted as culturally incompatible with British values and legal traditions. His first demand: repeal the ban on pepper spray, at least for women. In the United States, pepper spray is widely available and considered a basic self-defense tool. In Britain, it's classified as a prohibited weapon, with possession potentially resulting in criminal charges. Farage's argument was straightforward. In a nation where knife crime has exploded and police response times have stretched to the point of ineffectiveness, law-abiding citizens, particularly women, who are disproportionately victims of violent crime, should have access to basic defensive tools. The current situation leaves potential victims with no options beyond hoping they can outrun an attacker or that police will arrive in time. His second major proposal was even more controversial: enact the castle doctrine, giving homeowners the explicit right to defend their property with force. This principle, enshrined in American law and culture, holds that individuals have no duty to retreat when facing a threat in their own home and may use reasonable force, including lethal force, to protect themselves and their property. In Britain, the legal framework operates very differently. Homeowners who use force against intruders face potential prosecution themselves, with courts carefully scrutinizing whether the defensive action was proportionate to the threat. There have been numerous cases of homeowners being charged with assault, or even murder after defending themselves against home invaders, creating a chilling effect where citizens fear legal consequences for protecting their own families. The response to Farage's proposals was immediate and overwhelming. Within just 3 hours, 2.3 million comments had been posted across social media platforms, the vast majority supporting his call for expanded self-defense rights. The demand was consistent: British citizens wanted the right to protect themselves, just like in the United States, because the current system leaves them defensively naked in the face of rising violence. The argument resonated because it spoke to a fundamental fear. In Britain today, a victim relies solely on the police, who might arrive only when you're already dead. The police are understaffed, overwhelmed, and operating under legal and political constraints that often prevent effective action. When seconds count, the police are minutes away, and victims are left with no legal means to protect themselves. The deportation demand, Farage's most explosive proposal, but it was Farage's third major proposal that earned him the harshest condemnation from the government and much of the establishment media. He insisted on the deportation of over 600,000 new arrivals back to the Middle East and Africa, essentially demanding the reversal of years of immigration policy in a single, dramatic action. Prime Minister Starmer immediately branded this proposal as a flagrant violation of all human rights, framing it as beyond the pale of acceptable political discourse in a democratic society. The government positioned Farage's demand as racist, xenophobic, and incompatible with Britain's international legal obligations and humanitarian commitments. But Farage wasn't backing down. He vowed to create militarized units similar to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in the United States, dedicated forces with the authority, resources, and mandate to identify, detain, and deport individuals in the country illegally. It was a proposal that consciously modeled itself on the American immigration enforcement system, which, whatever its controversies, operates with far greater assertiveness than Britain's perpetually constrained border force. Farage went further, revealing that former President Donald Trump has repeatedly hinted that he could assist with specialists to help make Britain safe again, a deliberate echo of Trump's campaign slogan and a signal that Farage sees the incoming Trump administration as a potential ally in transforming British immigration enforcement. The zombie knife ban, a case study in legislative failure. While Farage was proposing dramatic overhauls of Britain's approach to self-defense and immigration, the Starmer government was pursuing what it believed to be practical, achievable solutions. Chief among these was a law banning the sale of so-called zombie knives, large, intimidating blades often featuring serrated edges, holes, and aggressive styling that make them particularly popular with young gang members. The ban was announced with considerable fanfare, positioned as a concrete step to reduce knife violence by limiting access to some of the most dangerous weapons. It was exactly the kind of targeted, reasonable-sounding intervention that governments love: specific, measurable, and seemingly uncontroversial. It was also a complete failure, a case study in how surface-level solutions that don't address underlying realities become counterproductive.